rated as well. And you'll see there's just a message that came up where we are going to record this so we can make it available for people afterwards as well. So, all right. So today we're going to start with just finishing up green target. We kind of got into it a little bit last week, but wanted to get into the adjustments on the green target section. And then just show a few more examples in the Form 1 in terms of where the adjustments go, what the typical ones are, things like that. So as we talked about, generally the green target is evaluating how difficult it is to hit the green. There are a lot of things that we look at: how big is the green, how far the shot is, if we can see it, if the green is firm. And then we talked briefly about this concept of a transition zone. In our table here, you'll see at the bottom, there is a 50-50 transition zone rating value. And we're not going to get into that concept quite yet because it's fairly complicated. But what you'll see is, just like we talked about last week on your Form 1, you could see in this approach shot, this TZ, and that's what they're referencing, this transition zone. So for all intents and purposes, when we see that TZ, we're going to assume that when we put our green target value in, we're going to use this bottom row here, unless there's something that either gets us out of transition or we might have, a layup or something like that that would make that TZ null and void. So if you do see TZ, that's what it stands for, transition. And 9 times out of 10, you're going to just pump in this value down here in the bottom row. All right, so let's just go ahead and start talking about some of these adjustments. We talked about the chart and kind of how it works. You can see there's a separate chart for both men and women. We look at our approach shot length for bogey and scratch. It's different, obviously, and we can look in the right column to get started. And then we look at this effective green diameter, which is on our Form 1 up here at the top. That's done by the measuring crew. And that allows us to get into the row. But then we have potential adjustments that we need to put in play as well. So the first adjustment here is the visibility adjustment. And that there's 2 adjustments here. A +1 if less than half the green surface is visible. A +2 if the green is completely blind, if I can't see the flag stick. And I'll tell you for sure, just if you haven't got to the green as part of a rating team and look back and realize that you forgot to look at the green to see if it was visible from your landing zone, you haven't rated enough, because every person does that at least once or twice. So typically this visibility concept is something that we talk about when we're meeting at the green. And typically when that visibility happens, there's always 1 or 2 raters that need to go back or need to check in with other folks to make sure that their landing zones, they didn't have visibility or did. So it's pretty straightforward in terms of, how it's defined in the description there. All right, and the V +1 is very common. V +2 doesn't happen a ton, but can happen depending on where you're at, what golf course you're at. And for all these adjustments on the Form 1, it's pretty straightforward in terms of how we write them on here. So if we're looking at this first hole here, if we have a visibility adjustment for our scratch player, we're just going to write a V+ here. And then this standard value that's been calculated for us goes from a 3 to a V +1, which is a 4. And then if we take our table value for our TZ, we'll just do this example while we're looking at the Form 1. A TZ, of course, I didn't look for an effective green diameter of 22. For a male golfer, 22 TZ is a value of 5. So on our Form 1 here, we'll just write in 5. Maybe we didn't have a visibility for our bogey player. Maybe we do. Let's just assume that we do. And so we'll have it here as well. And then it's going to be that 5 value that gets turned into a 6. All right, so that's just kind of one example there. Some additional adjustments. So we have an O adjustment if there is if the approach to the green is obstructed by a tree in front of or overhanging the green. So this happens, frequently as well. You might have branches that kind of overhang the edges of the green. You might have, in some cases, this doesn't happen a ton, but you might have, certain holes that have a tree literally like right in front of the green. You can think of a couple that have that. It looks like we've got a question here, Matt.
Yeah, Kyle, on the transition zone, we kind of went right into the chart and how we're reading it. Are those predetermined, so they will be on their sheets, or will we ever have to determine that?
So yeah, so the transition zone will be on your sheet, and that will be predetermined based on the length of the hole. There could be, some scenario where you might get bumped into a transition based on if you have a layup or a dog leg or something like that. That could put you into that category, but that doesn't happen a ton. But I guess to answer your question properly, the answer is yes. There is a possibility that you could go from 150 here if you had a layup to a TZ. So if we had a layup here of 23 yards, and make sure I get the math right, 23 yards, our bogey player for man hits it 170 on the second shot. So over 170 would put them into a transition zone. So you could have a transition zone, but most, 9 times out of 10, the transition zone is, if it's there, it's going to be on your sheet.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, there are a few other questions here. For the V2 plus, is the green surface not visible or the flag stick is not visible? So that's for V2, it's that the flag stick is not visible. So that would be like if you're, really, really blind. And the reason for that is that this is just saying the V+1 is saying less than half. So it could be, 40%, it could be 0%, but the up to adjustment is when you can't see the flag stick at all. And then how do we handle the blind penalty area, especially behind the green? So in terms of that, penalty areas are going to be handled under laterals. So there's no visibility adjustment for laterals. They'll just be based on the distance from the around the greens, at least the edge of the middle of the green to the penalty areas. And there isn't really necessarily an adjustment if it's blind or not in that scenario. All right. So we talked about the tree obstruction, and again, that's by a tree in front of or overhanging the green. And then we have this T adjustment, a tiered adjustment. So this is an item that's going to be typically covered by the measuring team. And typically that would be even written on your Form 1. I would highly suggest that we're going to talk about a few things today that you should put on your sheet before you head out to the golf course, before you get going when we meet in the mornings. This T1, if you see a T down on your Form 1 here at the bottom of the page in the green surface ratio section, if you see a 2/1 T, then I would just go ahead and put the T in your green target here before you even go out to the golf course, because otherwise you're going to probably forget it. But if you have a tier, it's measured by the measuring team. It's going to go under a green target as well. And if you want to, so the tier definition is in the book, but basically just a general rule of thumb is that the elevation needs to be at least 2 feet. So what golfers, or what a lot of people think is a tiered green, may not meet the actual definition in the course rating system as a tier. So keep that in mind too. If you don't see, or you see something that you think might be a tier, there's an actual definition for what is a tier that might not meet exactly what you or the commentators on the PGA Tour think is a tier. So another just clarification on the visibility. So 50 to 100% of the green not being visible, but the flag is visible, is still a +1. And that is a correct statement. So 99 times out of 100, we're going to have the +1 V adjustment. All right. Then the next adjustment here is a Sperm Adjustment. And this is something that, again, we typically don't apply. Again, we're looking at the golf course when we're rating it for a 10-year period. And when we're there, just because we might have had a bunch of rain the weeks leading up to it, or might be a particularly wet time of the year, we're not necessarily going to, or dry time of the year, we're not necessarily going to rate it based on the conditions that specific day. We're looking at mid-season play and over a 10-year period. So these types of firm things or adjustments that we make would be something that we would probably hear from either the golf course or some people that play the golf course frequently. Another common time where you might put in an F adjustment is on a newer course, or a course with greens that have been recently rebuilt. They typically take some time to soften up. So for a new course, or a newly renovated course with greens, we rate those on a more frequent basis every 5 years. So that could be an example where you might have a F adjustment there, but typically you won't run into that. I don't know if I've run into it yet in my time rating, maybe once. So, but it is a possible adjustment under there. Typically for green target here, we're just dealing with the majority of B's and O's, and then T's from time to time. All right, so just want to go through a couple things. We've talked about some of these items before, but one of the most common scenarios where you actually do need to look up the green target value is when you have effective playing length adjustments. So if we have dog legs or forced layups, we're going to have to change our approach shot like we've shown before. But then that's going to also mean that we need to reevaluate this standard table value, because it might not apply anymore. So if we have on our second hole here, let's just say we have a layup of 20 yards and then 50 for here. That layup is going to require us to make an adjustment to these yardages, right? So 150 and 170. And I'm going to cheat on the 150 because I know what the value is here. It's actually, I should probably just look it up for good practice. So we've got our green effective green diameter of 22. So, and then our approach shot's 150. So we're going to go back here to our chart. And we're going to say as a scratch golfer male golfer at 150 to a 22 is a 4. So is that right? Yeah, that's right. Okay. So in this case here, this didn't change our value at all. So we'll still have a 4 here, but it didn't change anything for us. Let's see if this for the bogey offer going up to 170 to a 22 changes things. So bogey offer 170, 165 to 185 changes it. It's going to be a 7 now. So we're going to have a 7 here instead of 6. So if you do have to cross out and adjust your approach shot, make sure you check that green target. It doesn't always change, as we see in this example here, but sometimes it's going to change. So we just need to double check that and look that up before we do all of our other stuff, because when we'll find out here in a second that green target is the starting value for what we come up with for recoverability and rough, or R&R, and then bunkers as well. So getting the green target right is a pretty important thing. Okay. All right. Any questions about green target before we move on to the next obstacle? Okay. All right, so R&R, or recoverability and rough, is looking at the evaluation of the probability of missing the fairway landing zone and the green, and then also the difficulty of recovering if they are missed. So when we're doing this R&R, one of the things that we do need when we go to our table, you'll see is the rough height. So unfortunately I don't have it on here, but typically on this form 1 here, you'll see the rough height listed right up here. And if you're looking at the chart here, you can see that in these charts, again, we have men and women, so separate charts again. But then we have here this section, this middle section is our grass height. So in Michigan here, we're cool season grass. So what that means for the chart is that we're looking at the numbers at the top here. The ones in parentheses are the warm season grasses. So those are your ones that you see down in Florida, your Bermudas, things like that. Maybe even the famous kikuya grass that you'll hear on TV if you watch the PGA Tour this weekend at Riviera. I think that's probably warm season grass as well. But in Michigan, we deal with cool season grass, so we're at the top in terms of the measurements. All right. So when we're looking at our adjustments here, we're going to kind of go through some of these here. We talked about layups before. When we do have a layup or the golfer hits less than a full shot, could be a dog leg. We're going to have a L adjustment under our R&R. And when you look at our form 1 here, you'll see under R&R that we have a column here for fairway and for green side. And so for the layup section, it applies in the fairway. So when you're writing it down, you're going to want to make sure you write it in the top row here. And again, all this one and many of these, any of the ones with asterisks are shot specific. So that means that it applies to a specific shot. And you'll want to make sure, in some cases, you could have multiple. So you could have, looking at M, for example, and we'll look at our form 1 here, M shows up in both of these. So you could have, a mounding adjustment, which M stands for, in the fairway, as well as green side. It doesn't happen a ton, but it can happen. So that is one example of one where you could have two adjustments, but you want to make sure you apply it in the fairway or the green side, wherever it comes into play. All right, so the next adjustment here is our eye adjustment, or the inconsistent. So there's a couple scenarios here. The first one is if the rough near a landing zone or closely bordering the green is much more severe than the rough height of the hole. It gives an example of something that's 2 inches longer. So this doesn't happen a ton, but it could be something where maybe the course by design, they want certain areas of the golf course to have thicker rough. Maybe it's by the green. They have, you know, two inch rough in the fairways and in the landing zones, but around the green, they want to make sure that it's important that you hit the greens and hit accurate approach shots. So they increase the rough height around the greens to 4 inches. Again, you don't see this a ton. You might see this more on a like tournament specific basis, but for normal play, which we're rating for, we don't see that a ton. But if it is an element of the golf course design, and this concept of like graduated rough, so to speak, if you're familiar with that, then it could be something that we work into. But again, it doesn't come up a ton. The next two are ones that do come up more often. So the -1 is where the rough near a landing zone or closely bordering the green is much less severe than the rough height of the hole. So we've seen a lot of courses go to this lately around the greens. They're kind of clearing out some of the areas near the green and making them a lot more playable, where golfers can recover a lot easier. So maybe instead of it being rough, it's just a little bit, it's more fringe, or it's more fringe type areas around the greens, surrounds that make recoverability easier. So you'll see those definitely out there. And these are typically, again, the key thing is it's a minus, so it's making it easier. And if we do have one of those, we would write that down for the green side. I guess it could be landing zone, but typically we see those green side. And then on the opposite side of that is if you have a significant portion of the green that's closely bordered by sloping ground that's cut to a height that results in shots just missing the green, ending up much farther from the green, which makes recovery more difficult. So you can see, you know, like a runway or like a very, very tight cut area that kind of runs off away from the green. If you think of, like, for example, if you've watched tournaments at Pinehurst and they're in those, I forget the term that they use for the greens there, but they're very slopey and crowned. And if you miss the green even by a little bit, the runoffs go off very far, and it requires a delicate chip shot up the hill from a tight lie. So that would be a scenario where we would want to put that I plus. And then in this case here, and really in both of these cases with the eyes, we're looking at a significant portion of the green. So when we talked about significant in the past, there's been a few things, and I think I have it somewhere here, but there is talk about exactly what is significant. Let me see if I can find it. I think I've got it here. Yeah. So when we excuse me, when we mention significant, what we're talking about here in a lot of cases is, in previous books, it used to say that 50% of the green, when we were talking about kind of this adjustment I plus, it was 50% of the green. But now we're saying that, you know, you might have a green where this runoff or this drop off, where we would apply an I plus, might not meet 50% of the green, but it's still significant because it's either in a location that's going to come into play a lot, or it's near an area of the green that has the majority of the hole locations. And so it's giving us a little bit more leeway to apply a adjustment. Whereas before it was just strictly based on if it was half the green, it applied. Now there's a little bit more discretion there. So there's a question, any relationship here in R&R to closely mown areas that comes up in the rules of golf tournament play? Not really any specific relationship, but typically these closely mown areas that you're referencing, Dennis, do potentially qualify for an I+ adjustment here. And those are very common areas that we would. You know, the key is just that it needs to be a significant portion of the green that we're talking about. So a little runoff, you know, over the back of the green, back corner of the green where the hole is never put isn't going to necessarily get an adjustment automatically. But if it's, you know, around the majority of the green or around the front of the green where a lot of the play or a lot of the play comes from, then, you know, we would definitely have a I+ adjustment in that scenario. And the same concept of significant, it also comes into play with mounds. So when we're talking about mounds here, we talked about, you know, what the definition of a mound was. It's something that has distinct sides and slopes. Here's just a good picture of, you know, one example of mounds where we have just off the green here, literally moguls that the course designer built in, you know, by design. And the other thing that's important too is that when we're looking at mounds, we aren't talking about any of the areas that are near, or sorry, are included with bunkers. So there's a specific section here that talks about closely bordering the green, or bunkers closely bordering the green. It says, what is a statement? Do not factor in any area that is closely bordered by bunkers mean under the Mounds adjustment. So when evaluating the area around the green for Mounds adjustment, any part of the green that is closely bordered by bunkers is already being accounted for under the bunker rating, including possible adjustments for depth or extreme, which we'll get to here in a minute. And then, so when determining if a significant portion of the green closely bordered by mounds, hollows, etc., the bunkers should not be included as part of the significant portion because they're already going to be counted under bunkers. And then the example here says that a green that has bunkers closely bordering 2/3 of the green, the remaining 1/3 would need severe mounds or a steep rise and drop to be able to qualify as a significant portion, since 2/3 of the green has already been accounted for under bunkers. So we can kind of use that when we're trying to figure out if a Mounds adjustment does apply, how much of the green is actually bordered by bunkers, because we can't consider that in our Mounds adjustment. And then here's another good kind of explanation of mounds. And this is this section here is from the course rating manual, which unfortunately we don't or can't share with everyone per USGA rules, but we did want to bring it into the training session here. So mounds, again, we talked about on our Form 1, mounds can be both fairway and greenside. And here it's just saying that if they are considered in the rough near the fairway landing zones, that's when we can consider there. Or if they're closely bordering the green. But mounds in the actual fairway, if there's mounds or moguls in the fairway, that's not rated under R&R. That's rated under topography, and that they affect a stance or lie. And then in addition to mounds where you have, you know, distinct sides and slopes, you can also qualify within the mound adjustment this concept of rise and drop. So an area of rise and drop that's greater than 5 feet can also qualify for the mounds adjustment or be used in conjunction with mounds or hollows to qualify for the adjustment. And then it says that, however, a combination of mounds and rise and drop may warrant an adjustment when independently they may not. So what that's saying is that you might have an area that's around the green that is maybe a quarter that has a drop of 5 feet. And then you might have a quarter of the green that has mounding. And if we looked at them separately, like we did 3 or 4 years ago, maybe even longer than that now, they wouldn't qualify. But together, they can make up a significant portion of the green. And so we can make an adjustment in that case. So again, this kind of allows us to be a little bit more flexible, where if we do have mounds or rise and drops that do make recovery more difficult, we can recognize that even if it might not necessarily 100% meet the definition by itself. And then the last thing here is just consider the impact that the mounds have on scoring. If the mounded areas were flat, could the scratch player hit the green mounds near the fairway, or get up and down near from greenside mounds? With the mounds present, how much more difficult is it to hit the green or get up and down? Is it not more difficult? Then there's no adjustment. Consider the downhill, side hill, and uphill lies of various sides of the mounds in this evaluation. So one kind of rule of thumb that we have is, typically uphill chips around the greens are easier than downhill ones. So we're definitely more inclined to give a mounds adjustment when we have more downhill type chips that we're dealing with, because they are more challenging. So I know that's a lot with mounds. I think mounds is definitely an adjustment that gets used a lot, depending on where you're at, and one that you'll get more comfortable with as you do more rates and see more golf courses and get an idea of what these are and what these aren't. And then the one thing we didn't talk about is there's also a +2 adjustment, and that's if we have severe grass mounds or hollows and or riser drop. Sorry about that. Silence your phone. My apologies. This guy wants to. All right. So if you do have a rise of greater than 10 feet, which you could at some golf courses, you might even have a +2 adjustment in some cases. All right, and then on our Form 1, in terms of where the mounds adjustment goes, it will go here under R&R. And what I like to do for mounds when they're green side is to just throw the M in the middle of the thing, because they apply to both. If there is mounding around the green, it's going to apply to both players, regardless of the approach shot length or anything like that. While that maybe doesn't necessarily make sense, like if you had a 20-yard approach shot, chances of missing the green and having those mounds come into play is slim, but that's already kind of built into the table value when we're looking at mounds. So when I'm writing it on my Form 1, I typically write around the green side. I write it in the middle there because I know it's going to apply to both players, but you could also write it, in both, however you want. All right, so let's just go ahead. We talked about mounds. Let's just get through these last couple here, and then we'll go through a couple examples of how we get to a table value. So the surround adjustment here, we'll talk more about what the surround adjustment is under lateral, but if you do apply it under lateral, it'll also be applied here. And then there's this unpleasant adjustment. Again, not something that we do a ton. So, but if it talks about extensive areas of hard pan near the green, again, we're rating the golf course every 10 years. assuming that the conditions are, normalized over a 10-year period, not necessarily based off our 1-day experience at the golf course. And then this 2 adjustment, again, not one that really comes up a ton, but if you have rough that's closely bordering 2 or more landing zones on a 3 or more shot hole, and it is at least 4 feet or 4 inches for men or 3.5 inches for women. So again, we don't typically, our rough heights when we're out there are anywhere from 2 to 3 inches. We really don't see anything any deeper than that in most cases. I've not seen any rough higher than that. And then the last couple adjustments here, they do apply for bogey golfers only. So this, you'll definitely see these last couple adjustments if you're doing tees that are longer for the golfer that you're rating for. So if you have like the very, very back tees for men, or you have a 5,900 yard golf course for ladies, you're going to see a lot of these adjustments come up here, and ones that, again, you can get on your sheet before you head out, and in a couple cases with the 3 adjustment, or at least put a note there to make sure you look at it. So the 3 adjustment is if the bogey player cannot reach the center of the green on a par 3, or lays up and the area short of the green is at least 20 yards wide and is cut to fairway height. If it's not 20 yards wide and not cut to fairway height, then you'd have a +2 in that scenario. And then this bogey carry, or the C adjustment over here, is if you have to carry rough that's not included as part of a crossing obstacle, then you would have an adjustment below based on the distance to carry. And so it's different for men and women here. You can see that depending on what the height of your rough, it's going to determine what adjustments you have. Again, typically for men, we're in this first column, and then for ladies, we're either in the first or second column. And if we're in the first column, the distance needs to be pretty far, but it'll be something you want to keep in mind. And really, how this again works is, this is something that's not necessarily measured for you. You might need to get help from someone out there to go and stand at the edge of the fairway. And we're just basically shooting from where your tee is to the edge of the fairway, or where the fairway starts, to generate how long of a distance this carry is to get to the target. And again, it's carry over rough. So I know it's a tad bit confusing, but if you do have a tee that requires long rough carry, sometimes it's just going to be 20 yards and then you're right in the fairway. Other times you might have a substantial rough carry, just rough, not penalty area or heather or anything like that. That would be covered under crossing. But if it's just rough, if it meets a certain yardage requirement, you could have an adjustment for the bogey player only. Yeah, I would agree, Mike, with your comment about the bogey carry adjustment is one of the ones that's missed most. I agree 100% with that. I think it's something that we don't even think about, but really, one thing that does help you with that, especially if you're in the first column here with the rough height, is that if your landing zones are near the edges of the fairway, it usually gives you a reminder like, oh, I need to go back and actually check to make sure that I can get here without landing in the rough. And so typically that will trigger you to kind of look and make sure you look for that carry adjustment, rough carry adjustment. It's a little bit different if you get into the second column because the yardage is a lot shorter in that case. All right, so let's go through a couple of examples here of what we're gonna apply for R&R on our Form 1. So just looking at the table really quick, just again, we've seen a lot of tables that look like this. We have our scratch on the left, our bogey on the right. And you can see, like we talked about at the very beginning when we were talking about this, R&R, our starting value is the green target value that we had previously. So a lot of times the captains will highlight the green target row on your Form 1 because it's important, not only for green target, but also as a starting point for R&R and for bunkers. So there's a good question here, Ron. Do you add 10 yards for safe carry or use actual distance to end of rough for the bogey carry adjustment table? So in this case here for the bogey adjustment, carry adjustment, we're looking at what it is to carry, not necessarily to safely carry here. So it's at least that's my understanding. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not like it would be to carry a crossing obstacle where we're putting that additional 10 yards in. It's just literally right to the edge of the rough, no extra 10 yards like we would for a crossing.
Kyle, I would say that's exactly correct. There is no verbiage in either the guide or the manual that would indicate applying the safely carry application. So you're perfectly correct there.
Yeah, and I think the reason for that, at least if I had to try to describe it to someone, would just to be that there's not that much penalty for missing it, as opposed to if it was water. I'm going to make sure that I get past it, since I can play from the rough if I don't necessarily cross it. So, but let's go through a couple examples here. So we're going to start with our green target value, and then we're going to go to our rough column. So a lot of times, good tip, a lot of our raters will have like a little sticky arrow thing or a sticky note that they'll put near the rough column that they're in. The other thing that I've seen a lot is a actual sticky note that covers up the table that they're not looking at, because I know I've done this many times, but if you're doing a men's tee and you look at the women's table or vice versa, funny story, I think one of the, or maybe it probably wasn't even one of the first times I came out, but one of the times I was doing my numbers and I got to about the 8th hole and I realized that I was looking at the wrong table for R&R the entire time. So luckily I had an eraser and I was able to fix that, but not a bad idea to have a sticky note in here and just put the sticky note over the table that you're not looking at that day, so you don't get mixed up. So once we have our target value in our rough height row, we're just going to get our number, and then that number is going to go on the sheet plus any adjustments that we have. So let's just do a couple here. So I'll just throw in a couple numbers and then we can look them up here. So we're just going to assume that our green target here is 4 and 6. And then let's say we have a M plus adjustment here. So 4 and 6 for our green target. And let's say here, I forgot to say, let's do for rough, let's say our rough is 2 inches. So 4 and 6, we're doing male here, 4 and 6 for 2-inch rough. So for scratch, our target is 4 and 2-inch rough, that's going to get us a value of 4. And then for bogey, our value is 6. 2-inch rough gets us a value of 6. So it's 4 and 6. And then plus our M plus gets us to a 5 and a 7. And it doesn't always turn out the same as the green target number. It just did in this example here. But that's how you kind of look that up and get to your R&R numbers. If you didn't have an adjustment, it would just be 4 and 6 because we're just plussing 1 here. If we had a minus, obviously we're going to subtract from the number. All right, just if we had here, this will make these numbers wrong, but if we did have that carry adjustment here, The carry adjustment, or C, is just for the bogey. So we want to make sure we write that in the bogey section here. And that's typically just a C plus, or if it's more of it, maybe it's 2 pluses, you'd write that there, but that does only apply to the bogey player. All right, any questions about R&R in Form 1 and how that works? Okay. All right. So let's go to bunkers here. So bunkers, not traps. Don't call them traps. Call them bunkers, please. Bunkers, we evaluate how they come into play, how difficult they are to recover from. And again, we use that green target rating value as our starting point. And then we also look at a few other items that are typically done for us by the measuring team. So we're looking at how much of the green is closely bordered by the bunkers in the case of greenside bunkers. And then we're also looking at some depth adjustments. And then we're also looking at fairway bunkers as well. So the book or the system assumes that we have fairway bunkers on every hole. So if we don't have fairway bunkers on the hole, we need to put a negative adjustment to note that. So again, we're assuming that fairway bunkers exist. If they don't, we put a negative adjustment on it. And then bunkers within 20 yards of the edge of the landing zone in any direction are considered to be near. So in this concept of near, it's within 20 yards of the edge of the landing zone. So we have our normal landing zone that's 20 yards wide. We have 20 yards the front and the back of that. It's considered near. So when we're looking at fairway bunkers, keep that in mind. It's not just within that 20-yard window, it's 20 yards beyond and also 20 yards short. I can't explain why 20 yards beyond comes into play. That's one of the things that I don't necessarily agree with, but we don't necessarily come up with the rules. We just interpret them and follow them and rate them. So that's a scenario where, again, personally, I think that's crazy that if the bunker was 18 yards away from the end of how far I was supposed to hit it, that I would have an adjustment for that. But that's the way the system is, and that we need to apply it in that case.
Kyle, if I could just chip in there a second.
Yeah.
At the calibration information, we get information about averages, and the average length for female players, tee shots of 150 and the scratch player at 210. That's simply an average. There are opportunities for a player to hit some of their shots longer than that 150 yards and longer than the 210. So that's why they give that near area on both sides, short and long, because will be times when balls will exceed the averaged recommended distances.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense.
Agree.
All right, and then we also talk about the bunker fraction, the depth that's measured by the measuring team. So on your Form 1, you'll see oftentimes here in our bunker section, we have some values that are listed here. 2 greater than 3 or 1 or 3. What this means is this 3 here, or this 2 or this 1 is the bunker fraction. So if we go to our chart, we have one chart here for both men and women. And then we have in the middle here a fraction of the green that's closely bordered. The 0 to a quarter is number 1. A quarter to 1/2 is 2. A half to 1 or to 3/4 is 3, and then greater than 3/4 is 4. So that, that number that you see on your Form 1 is telling you what column to look at when you're looking up your number. And then the next one is the depth. So that's going to be your depth in feet. And for the depth chart, we do have, we'll talk a little bit more about that. There is a different one for men versus women here. And then you'll also see in some cases, you'll see a par 3 listed. And if it's a par 3, we won't have fairway bunker. We won't have fairway bunkers on par 3s. So there'll be an adjustment that we put in there. And then you'll see some holes like this one here that has just a 1 with no depth adjustment. What that means is that it didn't meet any of the depths that would require an adjustment. So it's less than 2 feet because that's the minimum depth adjustment that we would need to have a +1 adjustment. And then you could have some where there's nothing at all. That could mean a couple things. It could mean that there's no bunkers at all on the hole. It could mean that there's just fairway bunkers on the hole, but it's saying that there's nothing greenside on those holes where there's nothing listed there. So if we do have a hole without greenside bunkers, we're either going to have one of 2 values. I guess there are a few adjustments that we could have if there aren't any greenside bunkers, but typically if there's no greenside bunkers and the bunker doesn't exist on the hole, so that means with it, no bunkers within 50 yards of the line of play, then we're gonna have a 0 for bunkers for the hole. Okay, but again, keep in mind, if there is a fairway bunker on that hole, but there's no greenside bunkers, then the minimum rating is going to be a 1 for both the scratch and the bogey, even if it's not in our or near our landing zones. And so we might blow by it with our scratch player, but it's near our landing zone for a bogey player. If the bogey player gets a 1 because it exists on the hole, so does the scratch player because it exists within 50 yards of the line of play. Okay, so that's one that I see on the forms that are commonly missed. You'll see a lot of times where so we'll get to the form 1 here. Typically on our form 1, when we're looking at fairway bunkers, we use a yes or a Y and a no, and a yes and a no adjustment. So if we're on this hole here, 4th hole, where there's no greenside bunkers, we might have a fairway bunker that's in the landing zone for this golfer here. So we would write a yes to identify that there is a fairway bunker. And then it might not be in or near the scratch player's landing zone, but because there's no greenside bunker, they're going to get a 1. And because it was on the line of play within 50 yards, this person is still going to get a 1 for bunkers, even though the fairway bunker wasn't near their landing zone. So I can't tell you how many times I've seen 0 in this one. If it exists for the bogey and there's a fairway bunker on the hole, then it's going to be a 1 for the scratch as well. All right, let's go through. The other thing too is we talk about anytime we have a par 3, we're gonna have an N- listed in there. This is something that you can do prior to you going out in the golf course. If you have a par 3, there's no fairway bunkers, with the caveat that keep in mind that if you're a bogey player, that hole may not be a quote unquote par 3 for that bogey player. So if it isn't, then you could have a Y in this scenario here. In this case here, our bogey player it's a par 3, it's a 1-shot hole, so there's still going to be an N-. But if you had a 220-yard hole, the bogey player, male player, hits it 200 off the tee. So in that case, they could have a fairway bunker in that case. So it wouldn't by default be N-. All right, those are some of the things that are kind of automatic. Let's talk about a few things a few other adjustments that come into play. Actually, looking at the time here, why don't we, let's not get into, I want to go through really quickly looking up the table value for this, as I think it'll be important to get through that. So if we have, let's just use the second hole here as an example. We have determined that there are fairway bunkers near our landing zone. So we have a Y here for both of them. And then because this is a male golfer, our 3-foot depth adjustment is going to lead to a D+1 or D+. And again, I like to put it right in the middle because it's going to apply to both. So to get that D adjustment, it comes off this bunker chart here. I think I got it a little bigger here. But you can see that you have, for men, if it's greater than 3 feet, which the sheet is telling us, then we have a +1 adjustment that we put on our Form 1. So we're going to have a D+ adjustment here. So when we look up our table value, we have YY D+. Green target, we're assuming is going to be 4 and 6. So let's write that in there. That's our starting point. So 4 and 6, and we were in column 2 for our lookup. So column 2, this column here, green target rating for scratch of 4 gets us a value of 3. A rating of green target rating of 6 gets us a value of 5. So we have 3 and 5 as our base. So 3 and 5 is our base. The book assumes that we have fairway bunkers. So even though we have a Y here, it's not a positive adjustment. It's just, we're just assuming that it's there. So we don't need to add anything in this case. If it was an N, we would subtract, but we're not plussing for a Y. It's just saying that there's fairway bunkers. And then we have a D+ adjustment here. So that our 3 and 5 turns into a 4 and a 6. So again, important to note that this Y is not adding. It's just signifying that we have a fairway bunker. And then on the flip side, if we have an N minus in our value that we look up at the chart comes out to be a 1, or after adjustments, the value gets to a 1 and it becomes 0 or negative, we don't put a 0 or a negative number on it. If there is a value from the chart, it can't go below 1. So even if you had a 1 off the chart and you had an N minus, you wouldn't put 0. It's still going to get a value of 1. It's another common thing that comes up. It doesn't come up a ton, but a common thing that you'll see is value of 0 for bunkers. It's, if they exist on the hole, it's impossible to have a 0 for bunkers. Ooh. All right. Are there any initial questions? We'll go through the bunkers and the adjustments next week, and just a few examples here. And I guess the last thing I did want to, we talked about depth. I guess we could just go over this. When we are measuring depth, that is something that's done by the measuring team. But this little description here is, I think, important to know, because when you're out there, I mean, your chances are you're probably going to, want to check to make sure that they're right. I mean, 99 times out of 100, the depths are correct, but you might see one that looks a little off. But you have to keep in mind how they're actually measured. So it's measured from the points where most recovery shots are made to a height that would get the ball onto the area of the green where most holes are located. Okay, and it may be necessary to use an average depth for tiered or large slope greens. So we're not always going from one extreme to the other when we're measuring depths. So maybe in this one minor part of the bunker, the depth might get to a value of greater than 5 or greater than 6, but for the average depth of the bunker to get to where the average play is at for that green, it might fall under a different category. So we're not assuming the worst when we're measuring this. So keep that in mind. If you're out there and you think the number is wrong, chances are it's probably just because you're looking at one specific section of the bunker when we need to look at an average in a lot of cases.
Kyle, we also look at the direction of play. For instance, it might be deeper at one part of the bunker, but maybe that's not really heading towards the green, like where you'll be shooting at. So that's something else that's considered when we're doing those measurements. Yeah,
that's a great point, Lori. Yeah, I mean, you might have to carry it a tad bit farther to get to the back right part of the green if the ball happened to be there that day, but 80% or 90% of the hole locations wouldn't require you to go or to take that line. Yep, good point. And then our measuring teams, when they're looking at the depths, they start with a rating for the deepest, but they can temper it by evaluating which bunkers come most into play and how difficult they are to recover from. So you might have a really, really deep bunker that's in the back corner of the green, but you might have to carry 3 bunkers to get to that bunker. And so even though that might be the deepest one, we may scale back a little bit because that bunker is not going to come into play as much as the other ones. So on bunker depths, it's helpful to bring a ball to throw out from the usual gathering area in the bunker. So most of the bunker stuff is done by the measuring team in advance of the rating. And what we do is we literally have a bunch of old flag sticks, or maybe there's something else, but or like survey equipment that has, you know, all these distances on them. So we'll get in there and actually measure it and look at it. So you don't need to do a ton of checking on the actual day of the rate. It's going to be mostly just assuming what is on there is correct, and then just making sure that there's nothing crazy off on that. Or maybe they switched a hole or something like that, which happens from time to time. They might have wrote it down the wrong hole. If you see something that says it's, you know, it's greater than 3 feet, and you get in there and you get in the bunker and you can't see the green surface, well, you know, it's if you're of average height, you know, you're not going to be able, it's going to be greater than 3 feet in that case. Might be 6 feet or 5 feet or whatever. All right. Any other questions on bunkers before we end today? All right. All right. Well, appreciate everyone joining today and talking about a few of these obstacles. Definitely, you know, getting that green target value correct is really important as we cover today, just because it's the starting point for both your R&R and your bunkers. So make sure you get that right. And if you have any questions, we'll stick around to answer them, but we'll look forward to seeing you all next week, and we'll go over a few more of the obstacles, finish up bunkers, and get into some of the other ones that are a little, well, not that these aren't fun, but laterals and things like that, they're a little bit more complicated and have a few more adjustments. So. And there are multiple chats in here that Oakland Hills Clubhouse is on fire. So we'll keep our fingers crossed. I'm sure there's be videos and things like that. But that's unfortunate, and hopefully that gets put out, or I don't know any details about it, but it is happening. So you can look in the news and take a look at that. So
yeah, I just pulled up the news feed on WXYZ. It doesn't look very good. A lot of smoke.
Yeah. There's a question here. R&R table assumes that rise and drop is 5 feet or less. Sorry if I missed. What happens if it's more than 5? So yeah. So Ron, R&R, if it's rise and drop, it needs to be 5 feet or more. if it's less than 5 feet, it's not going to qualify as a rise or drop. And the other thing that we didn't talk about in here, but the other thing to keep in mind with a rise and drop is that like a rise is literally just coming from the green and up, maybe like that. If you can see on the screen, whereas a mound is something that has distinct sides and slopes on multiple sides. So a lot of times we confuse a mound versus rise and drop. If it's just a plateau to go up, that's just a rise and drop, not necessarily a mound. So, but it does need to be over 5 feet, but you can have a scenario where maybe it doesn't quite get to 5 feet, but you have mounding all around, and you might collectively make a M adjustment there, but typically it needs to be over 5 feet in order to qualify for a Mounds adjustment. So there, yeah. So if it's not 5 feet, and with which, you know, you'll see rises or drop offs around greens that aren't 5 feet a lot out there. But it needs to be at least 5 feet to get that to qualify as a rise and drop and have an M adjustment specifically just for that. Yep, and then as Mike said, if it gets to 10 feet, then you could have a 2+ adjustment. You don't see a ton of those. I think the only one I can remember that I did for the uphill 10 was, of course, was it Brayburn and Plymouth. I think it was like the 5th hole or something like that, where you literally just, the green was like as wide as my desk here, and you just went straight uphill, like all the way to the next tee, and it was, you know, 15 feet uphill and just an impossible recovery shot. So that one we did a ++ there.